Hello, Basile. My name is James Rosenstein. I'm on the board of One Business World. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. So we're going to have as our speaker now, Basile Senesi. He's the Chief Revenue Officer of Hum Capital, and he will be focusing on from frontline sales to building revenue engines. So Basile, I hand over to you, and thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, James. So before I get too far into talking about, how I think about sales as a science and sales as a process, I wanted to give you all a quick primer on who I am and how I got here. My background historically had nothing to do with sales. I, for a long time, didn't realize that that's the track that my life would allow me to follow. I started actually running a small business up in Northern California back in 2011 or so, and had the pleasure to kind of understand the ins and outs of running business operations, but at a relatively small scale. When I moved to San Francisco back in 2013, I knew that I wanted to translate those skills to something that was relevant and made sense here in the Bay Area at San Francisco. I was very fortunate to kind of stumble my way through a handful of conversations and eventually landed a job as a frontline sales development representative at a tiny company you might have heard about called Intuit. Intuit is the makers of QuickBooks, et cetera. And they were a great teacher and mentor to me, where I managed to learn the ropes and really understand, how a company that has figured out a sales model should run a sales organization and team. And I drew a lot from that experience. I went from, picking up the phone and cold calling small businesses all across the country to eventually visiting and selling to those folks in person, to eventually managing a team of people doing exactly that. And I took all those lessons and then translated them to a brand new startup at the time that no one had really heard about called Fundbox. Fundbox was in this emerging category back then called fintech, and specifically was focused on lending to small businesses. And they asked me to come on board when, they were 12 or so people, where it was so early that you couldn't turn on the toaster, the microwave, and the Wi-Fi all at the same time. And in that time, right, they asked me, look, we don't know how to sell B2B credit for digital banks. No one's really done this before, but we feel like you might be able to help us figure it out. So we tried a whole bunch of different things and ultimately came up with a recipe that worked. Eventually, hired a few people to continue repeating that process, hired leaders, separated the team out into different areas of specialty, and eventually, built what amounted to a 300-person business, bringing in north of $120 million a year in revenue through many successful series of venture capital fundraising events. And I learned really the roots of navigating the discovery of product market fit to building and operationalizing a revenue team around all of that, and eventually scaling, tinkering, and tweaking the formula to really maximize our results. Really formative experience, so much so that I got to advise a number of startups, specifically in the fintech space, on those lessons that I had learned the hard way. I worked with companies like Pipe, with Modern Treasury, and ultimately with Hum Capital, where I am today, as an advisor, helping them sharpen their revenue and sales motion, helping them see around the corners that, I wish I had known about back in my early days at Fundbox. And in that period, I've developed a passion for thinking about building sales much more as a science than, a pure art form. I've learned a lot of the levers, the mechanics that go into that process, and I'm really excited to share, some of those with you guys today. As a disclaimer, I have the benefit of having been born and raised in France and really assimilated to culture here in the US. And it's given me an interesting perspective. I live just north of San Francisco with my wife. And, when I'm not spending my time thinking about go-to-market and sales, I do usually what any good French person loves to do, drink wine and make wine. So if you guys ever want to talk beyond revenue, happy to talk about that as well. That's a little bit about me. I think with that in mind, the story I kind of want to take you guys through today are some tidbits on how to think about building a scientific customer acquisition engine and function. Because again, sales is more than just an art form. It's more than just a process. a lot of what it means to successfully sell and build a team that, brings in predictable revenue is all about measuring the right things, and then solving for inefficiencies along the way based on the insights and the signals that you're generating. It's a lot. I think we'll unpack some of that today, and I'm happy to continue the conversation through the rest of this, this event and beyond that for any of those of you who'd like to connect with me there as well. So when you think about the sales engine, it's easy to kind of think about it as, to make a metaphor, I like to think about it as a car. There's really two sides to sales. When we talk about sales, we're really talking generally about the engine portion of the car, but the engine doesn't run unless you also think about the fuel that you put into that engine. Practically speaking, sales is two things. It's the engine and it's the fuel. It's the method by which you get things to move, and it's also what you put into that engine in the first place. And I want to start with a quick primer on the fuel itself, because ultimately you can build the best engine in the world. If you're not putting the right stuff in it, it won't matter. The way I like to think about sales is by thinking about the customer lifecycle, what we call the buyer journey, right? And that journey obviously starts before anyone knows about your company and your business, and ends with them being a loyal, retained customer. And there's a lot of milestones along the way between which, that particular prospect or customer and a company can kind of discover one another and figure out if there's a fit. The fuel, that's what we call lead generation. And sales is one of many ways in which a customer can actually acquire, or a company can acquire customers. It's important to kind of talk about this because you could build the best sales process in the world. Again, if you're not putting the right things into that sales process, it won't matter. I learned about this the hard way at Intuit, actually. Before I left for Funbox, we had oiled the engine for acquiring customers so well that we kind of stopped thinking about what we were putting into the engine in the first place. And we got to a point where we kind of ran out of fuel. We had no more customers that we could get in front of and sell to, and had to think really hard about how we were going to find more. And it, borderline brought us to a standstill there for a couple of months until we figured out a better way to expand that market and think about that formula. When you think about the fuel, there's three types. Lead generation breaks out between referral channel, marketing, and sales. Sales in this context, in the context of fuel, that's here's a list of people, here's a phone or an email, go get them, have fun, contact them, tell them what you're doing. And the ones that raise their hand from there are the ones that you'll ultimately sell to. But again, there's other ways when you start a business to get in front of customers, right? Referrals are everything from you started a company and your friends and family want to make sure you're successful, so they send people they know to you, all the way to there's companies out there whose main mission in life it is to aggregate demand and send it to different providers of services. Think Kayak for airlines. That exists for, in my space, B2B credit. Some companies aggregate demand for credit and send it out to different credit providers in the space. The marketing side is probably what you might expect. Either it's I pay for digital advertising, I drive traffic to my website through really good SEO, but it can also be things like I put on events and spend money on that, to I put billboards on the side of the road, to I generate really good content, to I do events like this. At the end of the day, the reason it's important to kind of talk about this nuance is each of those three fuel types have very different dynamics and benefits to them. And getting a sales motion right is about blending these three in the right way at the right time. The two things to keep in mind here, some of these channels are more expensive than others. Some of these channels take longer to produce results than others. And then ultimately, when you blend the cost over time, you have different levels of efficiency. What that means, practically speaking, right, is if we think about it from this perspective, the metric to measure here is what we consider lifetime value, how much you make on a customer, relative to customer acquisition cost, CAC, how much it costs you to get a customer. And you find that there's this interesting relationship where marketing costs you a lot of money and you make very little at the beginning, but eventually, when things work really well and you've figured out the formula, the customers you acquire through that channel are much more efficient. Dollar for dollar, your dollar goes further. On the flip side, direct sales is the opposite, right? If you start by hiring two people, give them an email and a list of people to get in touch with, they'll get results pretty quickly. But every time you want to keep growing your sales results, At some point, you're going to reach peak efficiency and you're just going to have to keep hiring more and more and more people. And that means your costs are going to stay relatively linear, even as revenue grows. Your efficiency is not going to get better. Referrals allow you to be somewhere in the middle. But the bottom line here is once you get started, you got to get started in the right order and layer these channels together over time, not wait 6 months or 12 months to start your marketing process. Because if you do that, then by the time you're seeing your direct sales results flatline, your marketing results still have a long way to go before they start producing. This is an important primer here. I'll repeat it one more time because I can't stress it enough. You can hire the world's best salespeople. If you don't give them the right fuel, it won't matter. They can't be successful. This is the first key to building a scalable sales organization. And again, it's a lesson I learned the hard way in multiple different instances. And it's also been what ultimately made us incredibly successful at Funbox, figuring out this mix. Now, once you've actually thought about acquiring customers and how you're going to get in front of them in the first place, you've started the conversation with them. It's all about what do you do with that conversation? And if we go back to our picture of thinking about the customer journey, I want to zero in on what happens first off at the lead generation stage. How you think about this sales as a fuel kind of method. How do you get in front of potential customers with a sales organization? The first thing to map out and to understand is that different people buy in different ways. And especially in business to business sales, there's often more than one person, and the person who's making the decision might not necessarily be the person that you're initially talking to. Each type of person cares about something different based on the type of work that they do. One prime example of this, and we did this for a client of mine called LensFlow. LensFlow is a company I've been working with very closely, also in the fintech space. And they had a pretty interesting challenge. Look, like we're sending a bunch of emails and we're kind of getting some responses, but we find that we're only winning a certain type of customer and not the rest. How do we kind of diversify away from that? What they found pretty quickly was like, look, you got to tailor your message. And so we helped them kind of break it out into, okay, who are the people you're talking to? And then how can we personalize your messaging, both across email and phone, to sound relevant to those particular types of people? Think about it this way, right? For them, they helped companies embed credit products into their platform so that they could issue credit services to their customers. Well, different people make that decision. On the one hand, a CEO might be the one who cares about things like, I want to grow revenue per customer by giving them a new thing we can monetize like credit. Whereas a product team might say, look, I want to build a credit program and it costs me a lot of time, resources, and energy to build that. How do we make that faster, right? Well, by being able to say a product person cares about this and a CEO cares about that, you can start actually identifying the things that are going to be relevant to them so that you can ultimately craft what we call persona matrix and ultimately build what we call sequences. So if you've ever actually been in the world of selling, one thing that's really changed in the past few years is the advent of email as a channel and the advent of cadence management tools to perfectly lay out the series of things that should happen for every prospect that you want to engage with. When you take that concept and those tools and you apply a persona matrix to it, what it means, right, is every single touch point as part of a sales journey that you want to take a particular prospect through based on who they are and make sure it's tailored. So again, the first email to a CEO might sound different than the one to a product person, just like the third LinkedIn message you send them may also have some differences tailored back to who they are and what they do best. This is important because selling has evolved. Part of what this does, it goes back to this concept of sales as a science. It gives you a lot of visibility and signals into what your customers care about and how to best communicate with them and how to put the most effective and efficient message in front of them, which is of course helpful to better communicate, but it's also helpful because it tells you which direction your product should build towards, what you should think about as far as innovation goes to better serve the customers that you're getting in front of, rather than sharing everything and anything that your team does with every single customer. You make it tailored to them. It's been a lot of fun getting to learn this, and I learned this the hard way. I've learned this from, again, my Intuit days to my days now at Hum, seeing things go from here's a list of 1,000 people, here's a message, a script, pick up the phone, call them and tell them the same thing over and over again, to today being able to send out 10,000 emails with every single one of those emails receiving a much higher likelihood of actually being engaged, because the messaging behind each one of them feels relevant in ways that, technology in the past didn't allow, but technology today very much makes possible. This is a quick example, and I'll share this deck in case you guys are curious afterwards, so you can kind of see what it looks like. But the idea is you take those messages and you tailor them to the right person, and then you layer them in order. Now, it's not enough to get in front of potential customers. There very much is art to selling. The science portion is getting the conversation started, but the art form is systematically understanding what a customer wants and making sure they understand your product delivering that particular solution. And this is really the hard part. For me, my recommendation and my advice in my career has been, look, master the art so that you can then elaborate on the science and you can manage the science, right? If you only ever understand what we call revenue operations or sales operations, you're missing the nuance of what it means to be a salesperson and actually deliver convincing information to people on the other side of a phone or a Zoom in a way that makes them want to buy your solution. You can optimize dashboards all day. You can run reports and crunch numbers all day. But if you're not presenting information in the right way, in the right order, to the right person at the right time, you're not going to be able to ultimately move the needle on results. And starting with defining a tight sales process and learning the methodology of selling is really, really key. Something I learned very early on at Funbox when we started the sales process was, look, don't sell to everybody, sell to the right people. And identifying what the things that allow you to spend your time effectively are really, really critical to making sure you're not wasting your time in the wrong direction. We sold to businesses in the US using an accounting platform. Well, great. That makes for very easy qualification criteria. And then we also found that of those people, only a subset of them saw value in our solution for a variety of reasons. So we double clicked on that again, and we were able to zero in on delivering messaging and targeting people who met those particular criteria. And once you actually are in front of a customer, this is really where the difference between getting a conversation started and closing a conversation kind of come into play. Some of you may have heard of MEDIC or MEDPIC. BANT is another kind of acronym for thinking about this. The bottom line, sell to the right person at the right time by saying the right thing. That person has to have the ability to spend money for the company or for whatever product it is that you're putting in front of them. Has to have the authority to make decisions for the company, has to actually have a problem worth solving, and ultimately has to be wanting and willing to solve that problem in a non-open-ended way with a clear point of view on when they want that problem fixed. If you have BANT, you can ultimately sell anything, assuming that it aligns with the BANT kind of matrix that you have for that particular person. Now, I call all these things out. It's a little academic, but I think the important part when I think about my journey, it's really followed two sorts of tracks. Measure the right things, which we talked about. Make sure you have the right fuel, layering it at the right time in the right order. Follow a consistent process to generate the right signals off of that thing. And then make sure that the people that are selling follow a tight methodology informed by art form, and really let them express their salesmanship or saleswomanship in a way that kind of conforms to a tightly defined sales process. Because at the end of the day, what matters more than anything is making sure that you're following some repetition, some method to the madness, and that closing business isn't something random, but it's something that can be repeated over and over again and improved on over and over again. That's probably the single biggest lesson I learned. You guys hear me okay? I think there we go. Makes all the difference between. Apologies, my headphones decided to kick in. As I was saying, I think the bottom line for me, the difference between somebody being a good salesperson and somebody running a sales organization is the ability to flex between the science and the art, between the what do we need to measure and what do those signals tell us, all the way down to and how do we have the right conversation in the right way with the right person at the right time. Mastering both those things have been really instrumental in me getting to where I am in my career. And for any of you who are pursuing or wanting to pursue a sales career, I can't recommend enough mastering the art form and then getting curious about the science part of it. And I'd love to have a conversation and continue it with any and all of you on what that's looked like for me and how it can apply to your specific situations. So I'm happy to open it up, James, for Q&A, and would love to take any questions from the group.
Thank you very much, Basile. Truly interesting. I'm going to ask you one question because to me, I can't be heard.
I can hear you.
Yeah. When you're dealing with sales, you also have the personal interaction with the person you're selling to. And it can be the same country, but it can be a different country with different attitudes, different approaches. And how do you build that into your process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. And, to some degree, it boils back down to the know your customer kind of commentary I was giving earlier. If you understand the drivers and motivations of the person on the other side of the phone or the screen, you can really tailor your message to them. And I think one dimension of that tailoring can be, what are the cultural norms and customs in that particular, kind of scenario? At Fundbox, we never ultimately ventured deeply into this space, but we explored for a time, moving into, APAC, and specifically starting with a move into Japan. And it was very clear that none of the playbook that we had really defined for the United States would apply nicely for a few reasons, right? To your point, at a personal level, the way that corporate decision-making happens in Japan looks very different than the US. And so identifying a person's role in the hierarchy and the, call it like procurement process for a business meant that we had to think differently about how we approached who we engaged and the value propositions we put in front of them. But it also was like one level deeper, right? Like, it's not just about the person in that example, it's about the entire ecosystem and the entire environment in which you're operating. And Japanese small business, the way in which you get in front of small businesses is not necessarily the same as in the US. Picking up the phone and calling someone you've never met isn't considered something that's appropriate. Just like sending an email unsolicited also is not something that's going to get you a great response. And so we had to think creatively about what are the ways in which you get in front of people in the way that they actually want to be communicated with. I think it goes back to understanding your customer, understanding your market, and doing the work up front, not to just cookie cutter kind of stamp out the same process over and over again, but tailor the message to the person on the other side, be it tailored based on their role, their country of location, or any other cultural norms that might predicate how you want to do business with them.
Definitely understand the cultural differences.
Absolutely. And it can be hard, right? No one's got a rule book on this stuff. It is a lot of trial and error, but it starts with curiosity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I don't see any questions. So Basile, I want to thank you very much. And as you said at the beginning, you're very interested in wine. I hope you saw we had a speaker today who was talking about that.
I did see that on the agenda. And I think that sounds like a really exciting conversation. I'm a little biased, but the only reason I'm in tech is to hopefully one day buy a vineyard. And this is a stepping stone. Okay.
All right. Well, look, thank you so much. And we'll certainly be in touch very soon.
Sounds great. I really appreciate the time. And if you guys have any questions, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to help and share any of my thoughts or advice wherever I can be helpful.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.